You're listening to NEMAcast, where we take a look at the hottest issues facing the electro industry. I'm Paul Rodriguez, and today we will discuss the International Standard for Product Safety Labels, ISO 3864-2, Graphical Symbols, Safety Colors, and Safety Signs, Part 2, Design Principles for Product Safety Labels. We will learn why there was a need for a harmonized system of safety labels that could be used on products sold both in the United States and abroad. Joining us today is Geoffrey Peckham, CEO of Clarion Safety Systems and chair of U.S. TAG to ISO Technical Committee 145. Welcome, Geoffrey.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
What triggered the need for international standards in product safety labeling?
Well, to answer that question correctly, I need to have you step back in time a bit. The ANSI Z535.4 standard for product safety signs and labels was the first across-industry national standard on the topic of product safety labels, and it was published in 1991. In 1993, the European Community established a single market to allow free trade and free movement of goods and people between borders. To ensure safety was upheld, the EC created directives for products sold to and within the European Community. For instance, safety directives were created for toys, medical devices, and machinery. Because a European directive is a legal act of the European Union, it has the force of law. Any manufacturer who desires to sell their products into the EU market must abide by the relevant directives related to their product. So when, for instance, the machinery directive was first put into effect in 1993 and a more robust version in 1998, manufacturers of machinery sold into the EU needed to comply with its provisions. And one of those provisions was, and I quote, information and warnings on the machinery should preferably be provided in the form of readily understandable symbols or pictograms, end of quote. Well, in the mid-1990s, there was no overarching standard for on-product warnings, and there was no definitive standard containing readily understandable symbols or pictograms in the sphere of international standards. So the publication of these EU directives sparked the U.S. to form a TAG, a Technical Advisory Group, to the International ISO Standards Committee related to safety signs, labels, symbols, and colors. A Technical Advisory Group is ANSI's term for the official U.S. standards delegation. This ISO Technical Committee in charge of safety signs is ISO TC 145. That's Technical Committee 145. I helped to form the U.S. TAG to ISO TC 145 back in 1995. I became its chairman in 1996, a position I have the honor of continuing to serve in today. The U.S. TAG saw that a product safety labeling standard was desperately needed by manufacturers who wanted to sell their products into the European market. But the future ISO product safety label standard we were to write not only had to function for Europe, it needed to be workable for the design of warnings for products sold around the entire world.
How long did it take to write the new ISO product safety label standard, and what's it called?
Like the ANSI Z535 committee, there were many people on the ISO committee that were skeptical that such a standard could be written, a standard for safety labels that could be applied to all sorts of products and industries. Because none of the other countries serving on this committee had product liability lawsuits taking place over inadequate product warnings, there was a huge educational role the U.S. TAG had to play to help the other countries' delegations to the ISO committee understand how on-product warnings function to help reduce risk. All in all, the standard took 8 years to write, which is a long time for an ISO standard, and was first published in 2004. Its title is ISO 3864-2, Graphical Symbols, Safety Colors and Safety Signs, Part 2, Design Principles for Product Safety Labels.
Tell me about the ISO standard. How is it different from ANSI Z535.4?
Well, right off the bat, the international standard for product safety labels is more graphically based. It uses symbols in all of its allowed formats, so safety information can be conveyed across language barriers. 3864 Part 2 includes formats that use the ANSI Z535.4 danger, warning, and caution signal word panels, and uses the exact same definition for these signal words and the colors as defined in the ANSI Z535.4 standard. But what's different from ANSI Z535.4 is that the ISO standard also allows a symbol-only approach to on-product safety labeling. This type of formatting works like this. Say you had a finger crush hazard you needed to warn about, and people avoided it by keeping their hands out of the machine. In the ISO standard, you could use symbols to convey both the hazard description and hazard avoidance messages like this. First, use a yellow triangle label that has a symbol in it that shows a hand being crushed between, say, two moving plates. Then add a second label that shows a symbol of a hand behind a red prohibition circle with a slash to indicate, do not put your hands in here. Hazard description, hazard avoidance, done. When you're using the ISO standard, it's important to know how ISO uses colors and shapes to communicate the type of safety message the symbol is to convey. For on-product safety labels, the most common types of ISO symbol types are a black banded yellow triangle, which is a warning symbol that alerts people to potential personal injury hazards. Blue circles with white graphics, which are mandatory action symbols that signify actions a person must take to avoid a hazard. Examples of these types of safety symbols would be those that show personal protective equipment, such as to signify wear eye protection, wear ear protection, wear hard hat, things like that. And finally, as I already mentioned, you have red circle with slash prohibition symbols that indicate actions not to take in order to avoid a hazard. ANSI Z535.4 is definitely not as graphically based as the ISO 3864 product safety label standard.
What steps did the ANSI Z535 committee take once the ISO standard was published?
First, back in 1998, we stopped trying to create a standard for safety symbols because we saw that it would be best to help write a global standard on this topic rather than create a national standard. A national standard for symbols would have only created a compliance headache for manufacturers who would be asking, which symbol should I use, the national one or the international one? After ISO 3864-2 was published in 2004, the ANSI Z535 committee looked at it closely and saw that the ANSI Z535.4 standard needed to incorporate two changes. First, the safety alert symbol in the signal word panel needed to have options that corresponded with the ISO standard, and this meant including yellow triangle versions of the safety alert symbol. Second, the ANSI Z535 committee wisely chose to add a passage in the exceptions portion of the ANSI Z535.4 standard that said it was fine to use any of the product safety label formats included in ISO 3864-2. The 2006 and current 2011 versions of the ANSI Z535.4 standard include these provisions, which essentially harmonize the ISO and ANSI standards for product safety labels. The effect is that manufacturers now can definitively create standards-based warnings for their products sold worldwide that meet both the ANSI and ISO standards. As the current chair of the ANSI Z535 committee, I can also tell you that the coming 2016 version of the ANSI Z535.4 standard, which will be in effect until 2021, will not be changing the provisions related to harmonization with ISO 3864-2.
So what would be your recommendation for manufacturers today?
Well, the long and short of it is that the acceptance of all of the ISO formats by the ANSI Z535 committee into the ANSI Z535.4 standard has made the situation one where manufacturers must choose the format or formats for their product safety labels that they feel best serve to communicate safety to their intended audiences, both here in the U.S. and abroad. I can tell you from Clarion's experience of having developed safety labels for thousands of clients in hundreds of industries, there is no one right way to design warnings. Symbol-only formats may be the right choice for one manufacturer, and symbol with signal word and translated text message formats may be the right choice for another manufacturer. The important thing is to, number one, know the ANSI and ISO product safety label standards well. Number two, know what constitutes best practices for the symbols that match up with your safety messages. And then number three, intelligently choose the formats to match the characteristics of your intended markets and your product users. I know my staff fully recognizes that the development of safety labels is an incredibly important job and one that deserves to be a top priority for every company who manufactures products that have the potential to harm. People's lives are on the line, and it's a privilege to help companies do this job well.
Geoffrey, thanks again for joining us today, and thank you all for listening. Stay tuned for future podcasts about product safety labels and visit podcast.nema.org to listen to previously recorded sessions. For NEMAcast, I'm Paul Rodriguez.